Hello, welcome to the panel on creating stronger conflicts in story. I've got four panelists with me for this one, and we'll start our introductions with Jay.
Hey, first of all, thanks, Josh, for moderating for us. I'm JRH Lawless, coming to you from unceded Beothuk and Mi'kmaq territory in Atlantic Canada currently. I'm a science fiction humor author mainly, I'm a lawyer by day and a repeat offender as a 2020 debut novelist in the middle of the pandemic. Hooray for timing. So yeah, my two novels currently, which are Always Greener, which was the first book in the series, and the sequel, The Rude Eye of Rebellion, which came out in September. So they both came out last year with a small press, and hopefully the third installation should be coming relatively soon. So yeah, I mean, I've had a chance to speak about quite a few themes related to conflict. In fact, I was just actually we talked about it a lot on the Right Hive podcast, which I was really lucky to be the guest of all the month of February. This is actually recording in March, so hello future. But we've only just finished the month of podcasts there with the Right Hive podcast, and really the amazing team there, amazing editorial team. It's a lot of fun to do, and we talked a lot about this theme. So hopefully there'll be a lot of if you like this, then go listen to that as well.
Sorry, I forgot I was muted.
Lost you
Taylor?
Yeah, I think I'll keep this short. My name is Taylor Vogt. I'm from New York. I write superhero fiction, like science fiction and fantasy speculative stuff where, the heroes team up and form this alliance that fights against the bad guy or bad woman or whoever they may be. I am a Master of Fine Arts student at Manhattanville College, and my publishing credit is that I was featured in Tiny Tales, the anthology by Run Rabbit Books, with a short story about the Gnostic tradition of Lilith and Samael. And I'm working on a whole bunch of stuff. And if you're interested in learning more about that, please reach out to me on Twitter. And I'm really excited to be here. So thank you very much for hosting this panel, Josh.
My pleasure. Olga, how about you?
Hi, I'm Olga. I'm from the Netherlands, where I live with my wife, my husband, and our three sons. I'm a screenwriter, and I've written screenplays for Dutch movies that you probably haven't heard about, like De Ontsnapping and De Schaduw van Bonifatius. Last year, I also won an award for the best screenplay that has not yet been made into a movie in the Netherlands and Belgium. I also write for games, I write books, and when I'm not writing, I love to do a little bit of amateur bricklaying. I'm a drag queen, and I also love making costumes, especially historical costumes. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. I really look forward to it.
I'm sorry, my American accent got in the way. Olga, I'll do that right from now on.
Yes, but if you can pronounce it's okay. It's okay. It's not the
That's no
best
problem.
part of the.
That was my mistake. Ari?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ari Augustine. I'm really bad at my own bios. I am a speculative fiction writer. I write a little bit of everything under speculative fiction. Published poet. I've been published in the Post-Gazette, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and Sad Girls Lit. I am also a freelance editor, currently working with a gaming company on graphic novels and kind of tabletop stuff like D&D style. I'm also the creator of Bookish Valhalla, which is a blog that works with publishers and indie authors to sort of rage about the stories we love. So academically, sorry, I'm a little nervous. Academically, I have a BA in English literature. A lot of my courses focused on like Tolkien mythology, reader response to stories. So I'm really passionate about how readers engage with stories and the Japanese language. So I just like working with writers on a more personal level, like a mentor, editor, creative support. So that's kind of my corner.
Very cool. All right, so today we're talking about conflict And I mean, first question is the most obvious one. Why? Why do we want to have strong conflict in our stories? Anyone can go first. If not, it's gonna be like school, and I'll just call someone out.
I'm happy to jump in
All right.
with the old screen order or reverse screen order. Why conflict? Because we like stories that are entertaining and aren't boring. And that's whatever the whatever the genre, whatever the type of conflict. There's many types of conflict. It's not that you're pulling out swords or whacking away at each other or lobbing bombs at each other. There's as many types of conflict as there are fields of human activity. But at the end of the day, it's about having characters who have goals and having impediments to those goals, that they can't get what they want right away. And that's what's interesting to people, because that's what we like to read about.
I'll go next, I suppose. You said that perfectly. The only thing I'm going to add is conflict adds that tension, that momentum to a story. You kind of need it to light a fire under everything. So it's, as you said, very engaging and interesting. And without it, it just kind of feels like a bunch of people are doing nothing. Like they're doing stuff, but also not doing stuff. So
Yeah. Go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, so I had someone break it down for me really easy this way a long time ago, one of my English professors. They were like, conflict is essential to the human experience. It's essential to understanding motivations and point of view and all of these things that are really important to a novel. She said, think of the first two people. One of them turns to the other and says, "You're not me," and that's the genesis of conflict. It's literally, you put two people in a room, they are not the same person, and therefore there ultimately will arise some form of conflict. And I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at our novel and we're trying to figure out what is it that will propel the reader through to the end, it's how strong is the conflict and how do our characters react to that conflict.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that's all. That sums it up really. Well, I can add to that, well, you don't need conflict if you want to write a story without conflict. Go ahead. I think for all stories and all these rules counts. If you want to write something without it, that's fine. Your story doesn't have to have it. But I think especially conflict, what Taylor said, is resonates so much with how we as humans experience the world. And I always for myself sort of define conflict as a cyclic model. It's, you always have this crisis of, you have a want, you have a crisis, you have a climax, and then it starts again. And I think for myself, when I look at my life, that's always the cycle we go through. We want something, there's a crisis when we want to get it, and there's a climax, and then it starts again. So I think conflict, not only on scene level, but also when you're writing a scene or a greater sort of arc, everything is can be made of conflict. And it's an easy model to sort of, light the dramatic fire. So that's why it's important, I think. But you don't have to have it if you don't want to.
Nice. I like that. That would be an interesting challenge to try and come up with a story without conflict, I think. And see
Yeah,
if we
well,
can still make that interesting.
I've been thinking about it, but I think there's, especially in movies, there's a lot of movies with very little conflict, like something like Mary Poppins. I was thinking about this whole afternoon, trying to come up with what's the conflict of Mary Poppins, aside from the kids being sad or something, but what's her deal with the world? And I thought, I can think of anything.
Yeah, that one's a very more character-driven kind of story, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but obviously character conflict is also conflict. I suppose it goes into your definition of what conflict is. But yeah, for Mary Poppins herself, it's a really good question, actually. What even are her motivations herself? It's not like a Nanny McPhee. She has a clear motivation built in. Mary Poppins is just like this supernatural being who is just there for the sake of being Mary Poppins at the end of the day. That's actually really interesting. But as an example, I mean, what's a story without conflict? I mean, I'm just trying to think examples. Maybe Waiting for Godot is kind of a story where they're trying to explore the absence of conflict. But even there, the whole conflict is the absence of conflict, and that becomes the conflict in a large degree. So it's, I don't know, when you take conflict in its larger sense of, you have characters, they have goals, there are, there are limitations to those goals, intelligence they have to overcome. I don't know if you can really have a story in our, occidental meaning and acceptation of what a story is at the social level. I don't know if you can even have one.
It's an interesting point. It's almost like I think sometimes when we think about conflict, we think about like big instances of external conflict, but even just asking a question that you don't have the answer to creates a conflict. Even needing knowledge that you don't have ready access to is a conflict. We just don't think of it as a conflict necessarily right away, but I think any sort of struggle, something that you need that you don't have, food, water, a friend, I think that can be conflicts. I think there are quieter kinds of conflict that we just don't define necessarily as conflict, but I think it could be in its own quiet way. And I think some stories do that really well, and you really have to sit back and look for the conflict. So
Cool.
I
I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, so I just got finished reading Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, and like this is like 140 pages of like 2-page short flash fiction before flash fiction was even a thing stories. They all sort of like meld together into this one long narrative, and these individual stories, they don't always have like this consequential world-ending conflict. Some of them are just descriptions of daily life and in like these invisible cities that are spread out throughout the book. But when you take the larger piece and the narrator, you start to see that there is some form of conflict throughout with Marco Polo and Genghis Khan and all these. My point is, you don't have to have like a strong conflict to have a conflict. I think that was what Olga was getting at. You can write particularly like those shorter pieces of fiction that are just flashes in the pan of a short story that isn't necessarily conflict driven. I just think that like what JRH was getting at, when you have these longer pieces, when you have these more intricate stories that are spread out over 300, 400 pages, that's when you get the need to have some sort of driving conflict, or else you're just going to be absorbing something without any like driving force behind it.
Yeah, I think generally as a rule, the way we experience stories, we want conflict. That's just, I don't know, I think that's our brain works. But I must say, I've read one of my favorite books is by a German author called Walter Moers, and he writes one of his greatest books is 13.5 Lives of Captain Blue Bear. And it's 300-400 pages of this insane fantasy world, and it's so cool, and nothing happens. There's no conflict in the story. So I've been thinking about this thing. I think stories that have little or no conflict usually are sort of atmospheric pieces, so things where the environment or your arena is really important. And I think in that case you can get away with it because you're so absorbed in worlds. And I think those writers are really good at sort of creating. It's also like in things, if you go to movies, I think Sofia Coppola does it a little bit. Things like Lost in Translation or Marie Antoinette, they're also mostly about the environment these people are in. And there's not much going on in terms of conflict. So I think it is possible, but I think we yearn for conflict in the way we tell our stories usually.
Cool. Well, I just wrote down Captain Blue Bear because now I want to see if there's an English translation of that, because that sounds really
I
cool.
hope so. It's really cool.
Sounds
He also wrote City of Dreaming Books, I think. I think that's an English That's also really cool about
Nice.
dinosaurs or having this sort of city with books or something. It's insane. It's really nice.
Yeah, it makes me think of kids' storybooks and how it's just, the fun of the ride rather than the conflict. So we're kind of already transitioning into what my next question was going to be, so I'll go ahead and just ask that one. Since we're talking about primarily fiction writing here, and the broad reader idea of what conflict is in fiction is the bad guy. There's the antagonist, the big bad person. So aside from that kind of conflict, assuming you want to write conflict, since we're discussing that, where else can conflict stem from? And you guys have already touched on it a little bit, but just to make sure everyone kind of answers that. Yeah, Taylor.
So I have to admit that I am the kind of writer to have the big bad guy, and so for me, the piece that I'm working on right now for my thesis, I've spent 25,000 words of him, the main character, having an internalized conflict over his depression. And so you can have conflict with oneself that doesn't stem necessarily from an external bad guy or organization or whatever it may be. I think that can be some of the most like compelling conflict, I believe, because if you are able to pull it off correctly, then you are putting the reader in the mind of a character who is fighting themselves or struggling with themselves. And I think that that's a universal sort of understanding, because we all go through that. We all go through, did I do something wrong? Did I do this? What did I do wrong today? How am I going to do this or that? We always struggle with ourselves, and to see that on the page is sort of like this universalist appeal.
I'm gonna call on Jay now.
Okay, I just didn't want to jump in, but you're absolutely, I couldn't agree more, Taylor. And that's actually, so in terms of sources of conflict, yeah, obviously it can be internal, it can be external. If it's external, it can be, a mustache twirling villain, which is obviously fantastic, but also it could be just the world building, it could be outside forces, it can be the environment, it can be social pressures. It doesn't necessarily have to be a specific thing. It can be economic, it can be family based, it can be romantic conflict. You can have 1,000 times, so as many different kinds of conflict thwarting the goals of the individual, and then you can have the individual realizing that their goals are not actually what they want, and those goals can change over time, and that can also be conflict. It's funny what you're saying about internalizing it, because that's exactly, again, plug opportunities, always greener. What in there, but basically just very briefly, it's about a 2070s reality show where they're looking all around the world for people to prove that they have the worst lives, and they are the 2070s biggest victims and most deserving of recognition as victims. So it's about this big sort of everybody trying to show and having these implants showing their lives to the whole world 24/7 to prove that they are the biggest victims and most worthy of recognition as victims. And so our character that we're following is the host of the show, who is exactly in conflict with basically this role that he thinks he wants, and that the whole organization, the corporate system, is pushing him into and making him do all these horrible things to his contestants, and that clashes with his own ideals and how he sees himself and what he actually wants to be. So the whole conflict is, him fighting himself, giving in, giving up, or then down the road, more in the second book, actually breaking and moving into rebellion against that. So it's there's as many types of conflicts as you could possibly imagine, really.
Yeah, Taylor, looks like you have something to jump off.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about internalization, but also there's also characters interacting with their environment. I read a lot of science fiction stories, and a lot of them have to do with space, and space becomes a character, like in The Expanse. And in the, when you're talking about a book like, or a series like The Expanse, or a television series like Expanse, what you're seeing is how this sort of inanimate existence, space, plays a pivotal role in shaping the course of events for the story, and is constantly in conflict with the characters and what their motivations are. And it's a limiting thing. when you're talking about a story like I don't know why this pops into my head, but that King Kong movie where the bugs in the environment are the opposition to the main characters, or there's video games, player versus environment is just like a staple of massively multiplayer online games. You have this opportunity to make the environment around your characters and the stories that you're telling be a shaping force or a driving force in the conflict of your story.
I just wanted to jump in and say I love The Expanse for that reason. And add to it a little, with your example, that I like how it shapes the cultures of the different people who live on Mars, Earth, and the Belters. Even the language and everything is just so shaped by space that you can't really escape it. Even if they wanted to go back to like their generations before living on Earth, they probably couldn't, at least as far as I got in, they couldn't. So I really like that you can have an inanimate sort of setting that has such an influence on people, culture, language. I think, sometimes we can take world building, well, those of us who don't world build as much might take it a little for granted, but I think the environment, we don't really think about how it impacts us. I mean, even just in a city, for example, somebody might not feel like they belong in that city. Maybe, from certain cultural or let's just go with cultural standpoints, they might be the minority in that particular area. So it seems like little things like that, but it has a really big impact. Conflict can be something as simple as missing the bus. Like, I'm always mad when I miss the bus. I'm like right there and it's gone. It can be really just ordinary everyday things that go wrong, all the way up to just these nuanced things in our setting, things that people say, beliefs that we have that now wherever we're living conflict with beliefs that other people have. So it can be as simple or complex as that. And I think really the whole life is suffering quote, life is suffering and life is conflict. And I think if you just kind of sit back and just look at your everyday life, you can really find some of those simple, ordinary conflicts we have to deal with. But I mean, if you think about it, just like an everyday kind of example, you wake up on the wrong side, you're already late for work. Then you miss your bus. Then you get to work late and your boss is yelling at you. This is conflict, ordinary conflict that's building into a bigger conflict. And I think that the little accumulations we forget about sometimes, but I think they're just as impactful. I like my favorite conflict is the nature, like person versus nature, because it's something we can't necessarily control. So the characters have to be creative, but you can also have something like character versus fate, like something just happening, or character versus religion, character versus their world, character versus their society. So I think back to we're going back to Taylor's point, internalization. How is everything affecting your character? Anything that affects them, makes them stop, think, feel, question. I think that can be considered conflict. Yeah, go ahead.
And it doesn't always have to be like explicitly spelled out, right? Like, you don't necessarily have to go on a 2 or 3 page exposition dump of why this character feels the way they are, and in the grand scheme of things, it plays into the greater story. But like, I read a story that was all action. There was no internalization. There was no exposition. It was just one thing after another. And even then, like, I could infer the feelings of the characters and really understand the motivations behind their interaction with the conflict around them, whether it was environment or internal or whatever it might have been, simply because I was going along the story with them.
Yeah, just to add a quick comment after that, one good example of putting nuance, internalization in there is just showing how the character, what they're saying is not aligned with what their physical reaction is. I think body language and dialogue can reveal a lot in a subtle way. And you don't have to have like these long internal monologues of processing everything. And I think sometimes the advice out there, which is to like have the action, then have the character process, then have them take another action, people just stop and just have them process, but that's not how life works. You still have to go. It makes me think of, I watch K-dramas a lot. There's a quote in one that I love where the guy is like, the shark has to keep swimming so it doesn't die. And he was trying to convey to the person, you have to keep thinking on your feet. You have to keep moving. I think if you have your character just stop. I mean, in some books it's fine. It works beautifully. But in some other books, it's okay to have them keep moving forward and internalizing as they are.
I think one of the things that the community of first person writers really needs to come to terms with is that what you're getting at, Ari, is like stopping, taking 4 pages to do an internalized monologue and then doing 2 paragraphs of action and do 4 pages of internalized monologue. I don't see it as much with third person, especially a third person omniscient. But the first person community definitely has that sort of stigma around it where it's like we stop and then we start and then we stop and then we start.
I feel like it's a whole chapter sometimes. Like they take a whole chapter to think about everything that just happened in the previous chapter. And sometimes I'm just like, why? You could be like plotting right now. You could be going after that villain. You could be doing all sorts of stuff. And all the time you're doing your laundry and cooking your dinner and like thinking about like the hottie next door. You could have been doing something about it. I don't know. I agree with that. Yeah, I feel like it's a whole chapter though for some.
Nice. That was good. A lot of good quotes from Ari today. I think the tagline for this one's going to be "Life is suffering." That's great.
That tagline.
No. Okay. Any other thoughts on non-antagonist conflict? Olga, did you have anything to say additional, or did they all kind of cover everything for you?
I think they just covered it. I will split my conflict in internal conflicts or external conflicts, and external conflicts in conflicts with the world or conflicts with another character. And that's basically it. But I think Taylor and Jay already totally covered it.
Okay, cool. All right, well then I'll just move on to the next question then, which is, since we've established this precedent, assuming you want conflict in your story, how can you tell that your story doesn't have enough? So you have a certain threshold you're wanting to reach, and for some reason it's not. What are the signs pointing to that problem with your story?
I think for myself, usually when I'm writing, I notice this because I get bored. I have a sort of telltale sign for myself if I'm just writing and it's like wading through mud or something, and think something's wrong here. And so the boring scene or the boring dialogue, there's always this point that I think, no, something's just not happening. And I think in stories or in movies, you can also see this because it just falls flat. And it's like the motor has stopped in your engine. So for myself, when I get bored writing what I've thought up, I just stop and try to go back and see what's missing. What am I missing here? And it's usually conflict.
Yeah, Taylor.
I think you can liken conflict and the motivations that it creates to be like the fuel in the engine of your book. If you don't have a strong enough conflict, whether it's going to the grocery store and forgetting your groceries or you're delivering the ring to Mount Doom, you have to have enough fuel in the tank to get yourself from page 1 to page 150. And if if you don't have that, you're going to peter out, like what Olga was saying, and you're not going to be able to get to the end of your own story. And I think that when you start sputtering along the way, that's a good sign that maybe you need a stronger conflict to get yourself to the end, or 2 conflicts or 5 conflicts, or however many you may need to extend your narrative to its logical conclusion.
I think for me, it's pacing. I'm really obsessed, at least in my own writing, with pacing and flow. And if it just doesn't sound like it's going anywhere. It's amazing how you can just type and a bunch of words appear, but it doesn't actually mean anything's happening. And I think, you know, when you have a lot of words, but it doesn't feel like the story's going anywhere, I think that that's a good indication that it doesn't have, as Taylor says, enough fuel underneath it. At least that's how it is for me. And when I'm reading stories, I don't know how really to describe it besides there's a whole lot of stuff happening and yet at the same time nothing is happening. I can't tell you how many times I've reviewed stuff with that in there, like there are a lot of things happening, but it doesn't seem to go anywhere. So that would be like maybe the first indication for me. Another indication would be like in terms of conflict tied to character motivation, if their motivations just aren't strong enough or aren't consistent, I think that that definitely impacts whether or not, you know, the conflict is there. Sometimes people put in too many character motivations and it just doesn't move forward. Sometimes the motivation is just weak. I mean, it just doesn't follow through the book. The arc isn't stable. If we want to use some technical terms, it's not stable. So I think those are two big ones for me.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have summed it up incredibly well. And that last point you said, Ari, about motivations is exactly what I was going to remark, which is that in practice, when you're writing, this phenomenon that you've all described super well, more often than not is just that you're writing and either, as you said, Olga, will be boring, or you know, you just won't necessarily know what the next thing is, what the next thing has to be. And that's because more often than not, you haven't defined in your own head and on the page clearly enough what the goals and motivations of the main character, POV characters, and all the other characters around, what they all are. And then you don't have that conflict and you don't have that driving force to go naturally to the next thing, because there will be a natural next thing, which will be, you know, as again, that analyzing situation, reacting to it, and then, you know, that, or that sort of, you know, but therefore and cycle that you get sometimes in plotting. So yeah, so usually you might not even necessarily, particularly when you're starting out writing, be able to identify that this sort of blockage that you're getting is actually a conflict issue and is a motivation and goal definition issue more often than not.
It's sort of when you get into conflict with your own story, there's usually a conflict problem.
I like that.
I always enjoy conversations with people who say, I imagine the middle and then I work towards the beginning and the end, or I imagine the end and then I work backwards from the end to the beginning. And you know, it's always more often than not, it's people who imagine the end, know where they're going, have even just a amorphous idea of where they want to end up, that have the strongest conflict, because they have an idea of where it is they want their story to end. So they just have to create an engine to get there. And I keep using these fuel and engine metaphors, and I'm sorry about that, but it's just that what's on my mind. Like if you enter into a story and you have sort of like this intangible unknown as the end of your novel, then how are you going to create the conflicts to get yourself there? And I think that at the end of the day, you sort of have to have some idea of where you're going.
Nice. I forgive all the vehicle metaphors. I'm just going to think of you as the meta mechanic from now on. So I feel like we've answered the next couple questions I had, so I'll skip past those for now and kind of go to my anecdotal one. Have any of you personally had a story that was broken due to an issue with conflict? I assume everyone has, we all have. And if so, were you able to fix it? And if you're able to fix it, how? And if you weren't able to fix it, then what did you do with it?
All right, so the story that I recently finished, that I'm querying right now, I rewrote like 65, 70,000 words of it because I got to the end and I was like, wait, there's a conflict here that I didn't like pay attention to. And now that I'm at the end, I know that it exists. So I have to go back and make it a reality. And I think it was more about getting that first draft done, or that first draft in a quarter done. for me to realize what the true conflict of the story was. And I know that that's a really harrowing, supposition for any author to say, oh yeah, write 95,000 words and then you'll know what your story is about. But at the end of the day, I think that that's something that happens more often than not.
I guess I'll go next. So I've been working on Godflower. It's book 1 of my Severing of Souls duology. And when I first started writing it, I just sort of vomited on the page because I was still clinging to my pantser status. But when I looked over it, it just did not have a spine to it. I like you do mechanic stuff. I do like body parts for my books. It just did not have anything holding everything together. So I became a sort of plotter. And as I kept going through each layer of plotting, I realized the first stage of plotting, I over plotted. There was so much conflict. I think one of my CPs was like, you are torturing these people. So I had to go back in and just really think about how to simplify, like bring it back to the simple and maybe up the character, like internal conflicts, and actually worked a lot better because my main character, Kyoko, is struggling with an addiction to magic serums. It's set in modern day, and the more she uses, the better at magic she becomes, but that magic actually impacts her heart organs, so it can kill you. And so I really just started focusing on that internal conflict. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense with kind of the middle of an end of the story I envisioned. And so I think over conflicting everything is definitely a problem that I've had when switching to more plotting. But I think working my way back, because I'm a backwards person, has kind of helped. So yeah.
Yeah, real quick, I think that one of the things you're getting at, Ari, is the through line. Like, if you have too many through lines, it's really hard for the reader to sort of keep up with all of the different things that's going on in the story. I always imagine like a really good through line as like branching. Like you have all these conflicts along the way that branch out from the main through line, and they're resolved as the story advances, so that the story continues and you have this one thread that leads from the beginning to the end. And I think a lot of people, they just get so excited because they have this new universe that they're playing with, and they're like, I'm going to have 20 through lines and they're all going to be resolved in the last chapter, and it's going to be awesome, and you're not even going to believe how great this is going to be. And then you get to the last chapter and you're like, wait, there's so much conflict going on. I don't know where this character has to talk to this character, but they're on the other side of the world. It's so like, I think that at the end of the day, having that one solid conflict through line and having those deviations that you can solve along the way is a really good strategy for making sure that you don't end up at the end with 20 different conflicts you have to resolve in 6 pages.
I feel so called out right now. Well, see, because when I discovered I really like researching and doing the plotting, and I literally gave a backstory to every single character in the book, and wanted it all to be in there because I like story-rich things. So I was just like, I'm just going to vomit this. But it's almost like forcing the reader to walk through a very thick woods, and they get smacked in the face by everything, and they're not quite sure. It's dark, they left their phone in the car. Nobody knows what's going on. So even I was struggling for a time, but I think, like you said, boiling it down to like the most important, I think, through lines that you have in the story. And I think I identified like 2 that were related. And so it ended up working out for my story. But yeah, definitely. I think boiling it down to the 2 sort of plot lines that are most important is a good way of avoiding that.
Your A plot and your B plot.
Yeah.
And that's where editors, whether it's independent editors or within a publishing house, are really worth their weight in gold, because I've had exactly the same experience. Actually, I really relate to what you were both saying there, both in terms, Ari, of one, in thinking yourself as a pantser to start out with, and then you end up like I did with a monstrous 120K manuscript, and realizing only thanks to, again, the editor coming in and saying, you have this major issue, that I was effectively trying to cram 2 books into 1 manuscript, and ended up with a big character jump, a big time jump, sort of 2/3 of the way through the book, because that's really where the break in between the 2 books was, and there was a big shift in the conflict. On one side, it was about the internal conflict, and then the conflict became external, and and those both need to be fleshed out much more completely in their own right on either side of that break. And that's how, again, I ended up with, from that 1 manuscript, with my 2 currently published novels, Always Greener and The Rude Eye Rebellion, over the space of sort of 12 years. So, that those conflict issues definitely are so structural that it's almost inevitable that at the same time we would talk about plotting, because they do go massively together. Even though it's character driven, it's inseparable from the plot.
I love this because I'm always under conflicting stories. So I love that you're all overdoing it. I'm underdoing it usually. And I think it's because I think screenwriting is, well, writing in general, but it's this giant 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and you have 300 pieces that look like blue sky, and you have to fit them together. And I think my problem is that I love characters. I love writing characters. I love observing people. People love just people talking. One of my partners said that I just love to sit and watch people speak, and I just absorb it all because I love it. And so I usually start with creating characters, and they're these really adorable, struggling, humane, failing characters. And then I build a world around them, and I make them struggle with each other. And then I realize they don't want anything. And in every screenplay, it's the same. So everyone loves these scenes about these people, and then someone asks, but what are they doing? What do they want? So at this moment, I'm working on a thriller series for the cinema, and this is about it's about standing up for injustice, and where's your tipping point for standing up for injustice, because you can see a lot happening, but there is a point for every person where you say no. Now it's become personal, and my main character is a woman, and she's always in the background. She manages a hotel, and she loves giving people privacy, and she's a really nice, struggling woman. So she's a bit dull, but in her free time she loves crime movies. And I've been writing and writing about it, and she just doesn't move, and she doesn't want anything, and there's a plot and everything, but there's always this point that I realize, oh shit, I have to sit down and I really have to think about what she wants and what she needs, and what's this conflict that she's trying to with the world and people around her. So for me, it's always I love a good conflict, and I love constructing conflict, but it's always the last thing I think about. Just like endings. Endings are, I love that Taylor said work from the ending, but I was listening to him, I thought, how? I just finished a movie and I wrote 12 versions just to get to the ending, because the ending was such a pain just to create. So I think as a writer, you always have strong points, and I think mine is character, but conflict is I really have to sit down and focus on it to make it work.
Yeah, it sounds like the classic pantser versus plotter issue.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
Finding that middle ground.
It's
Yeah,
really. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I love talking to people who do plot naturally for that reason. I have a reader who's really good with plot, so he reads my stories, and I'm really into character, so I help him. So it really helps me to have someone who's really good with that look at your story and say, but here's plot, and this is plot, and this is plot, and you can use this. And I think, oh yeah, that's nice.
All I was going to say was I swore up and down in my early years I was never going to be a plotter. Plotters are not creative people, because that's like the culture of pantsing. It's like, y'all can't just come up with something on a whim. But once I started plotting, I was like, I really like the very deep conversations I'm forced to have with my characters, and digging. I like digging now. It's almost an obsession to this point. But I don't think there's anything wrong with either. Whichever, if it works for you, it works for you. That's all that matters, end of day.
And beat sheets were a revelation for me when I, so I say, oh, there's this structure I can use to help shape all these ideas and things into something that actually works, and that keeps that forward momentum. And then when you're writing, you can always, that's what, I suppose being a pantser or whatever, it's a cop out, but it is at the end of the day, I think for me what works, because I always have that beat sheet and I have that structure and I have all these ideas that I put into there, and I build the Jenga tower. But then you could pull things out and put them whatever way, and you can get all these fantastic shapes. You can change it as you go, and maybe even fundamental act structure. Maybe you realize halfway through that your transition from Act 1 to Act 2 isn't exactly where you thought it was, and that it's you can always juggle with it.
Yeah, Taylor.
And those beats aren't necessarily all created equal.
Mm.
Like one of those beats might be 200 words. One of those beats might be 5,000 words. But it's you were talking about structure. It's so important to just have something to work within, I think, sort of grounds you in your writing process, as opposed to, and of course, this is the plotter versus the pantser, as opposed to just walking through the woods, like you were saying, and just seeing where you end up, because like that's the way that that you think that this story is going to resolve. I think that just having that structure to work within, being able to move and push the boundaries of that structure, that's another thing. I think that getting pushed back from the boundaries that you've already put in place will show you just how far your plot and your conflict can go. Without that pushback, you're writing 150,000 words, and then you get to the end and you're like, wait, no, this was not the right direction I should have gone in. And you have to rewrite like 75% of your novel.
That was me.
So say we all.
All right, so let's talk about some specific techniques, I guess you could call it. What are some questions that an author can ask themselves to strengthen the conflict and tension in their story? So, I mean, do you guys have any specific go-to questions or anything that you can think of now off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who works backwards, like, how satisfying is the ending? Do you really enjoy what you've written, or what you're going to write? Again, conflict is the sort of the vehicle through which the story progresses. Unless you're Olga, who has no conflict whatsoever and ends up at the end of her. And so the conflict being the vehicle that moves you from beginning to end. If the end isn't satisfying, then it's a very good possibility that the conflict that got you there, that you don't even know what it is yet because you haven't even written or imagined the beginning of the story yet, isn't worthwhile. I think that having that air of satisfaction of what you're working towards is really helpful in defining the conflict from the very beginning of your story.
Yeah, I mean, yes.
If I can defend myself, well, so I'm a character writer, and I think I sort of approach conflict and from a character standpoint. So when I'm stuck, which I'm daily with conflict, things that I ask myself are always things like, why is this problem so important or so hard for especially this character? Or what is a thing that especially for this character would be very hard? Because, well, I once had a writing teacher who said, and it was in class when I was in Dutch film school, and one of my classmates wrote a story about a mother dying, and the teacher said, that's really sad in real life. But in a screenplay, you have to tell me why it's sad for this character, why it's the saddest thing that ever happened to this character. Because death isn't just, it's not sad. You have to make it sad. So that was really an eye-opening moment for me. So why for this character is this the hardest thing that can happen. That's your conflict. And how does your character try to solve it? And more importantly, how does she or he fail at this? Because failing tells you a lot about your characters and what they're struggling with. So I always try to focus on the failing and what they want and what they try to realize. And I always come back at this thing of wants or needs and what does the character want? What do they need? And that's usually how I solve my conflict by really getting to the point. What do these people need to learn in the process? What as humans, how do they grow and what is stopping them? So
I like that. That makes it sound a lot less formulaic and a lot more story specific for any one person. That's a
yeah,
good answer.
I think I'm really I love it that you're all really good with structure. I'm always struggling with structure, and it was really freeing for me. I worked in the screenwriting business for a lot of years, and one day I had a mentor who said, "Just throw it all out. We're all, you know." Sometimes you can get sick of structure and just go with free associations. Just follow your characters, make it a natural process again. That's once it was for you. So that really freed me of because sometimes all these rules and structures can, for some writers, really can inhibit them because that's not how stories work for me. So I found my way back with it with these kind of character questions and story questions.
Yeah. I've always loved the idea that you have to know the rules just so that you can break them.
Yeah, throw it all
Ari,
out.
I saw that you were raising your hand.
Oh, yeah, I was going to add to what she was saying. Sometimes with myself, but also with writers I work with, I always have to remind them to think like a human being. You know, how would someone feel like if it's a scene in a book and they see their husband cheating on them with somebody else? Like, what's their emotion? What's their instinct? Like, what do they want to say? How are they processing this? Bring it back to thinking about how people respond to the things that happen to them, and how does your character specifically respond to this, because there are different responses. You know, some people might go kill their husband after the fact, or the woman. Some people might not. So thinking like a human, remembering that your characters, even if they're monsters, we usually personify them a bit. So, you know, thinking how people would respond to things in life. The second thing I usually ask is sort of in the vein of what Olga was saying, which is just thinking about what your character really wants. But I would take it a step further. And think about what they're willing to do to get it and how that will either benefit them or screw them. Because thinking of those consequences or potential gains, which can still have consequences, like you can win, but also still lose. The whole win the battle, lose the war. So I think that just thinking about like that relationship between our feelings and what's happening and how we're responding, then interacting with what's happening to us is a really good way to do that.
In terms of questions, I suppose the only thing I would add is, that basic, and this is more at the editing phase once you have your manuscript, but it's also good to keep in mind during drafting as well, is that each bit, however you want to define a bit, whether that's a scene or whether it's an individual sentence, whatever, but as a general rule, each part of your story should be doing multiple things. And so it should be developing characters, should be doing world building, should whatever as much as possible. And conflict is a big part of that. So, if when you're looking at your story, and you ask the main question, what is this doing? What is it for for as a craftsperson? That's probably the most common metaphor, and the one Stephen King certainly uses, and a lot of other people. And is having that toolbox, and it's you're building a house, a structure, so that you can then support whatever fantastic thing you want to put in there, but to have the framework. It's to ask that fundamental question: what is this for? What is it? Is it doing what it needs to be doing? And what changes need to happen if that's not the case? That's all.
Oh, that reminded me of something. you were dancing around it. Is this necessary? Like, does this need to be here? I think that is one of the hardest questions to ask, because sometimes you write, I'm a descriptive writer, so everything is like art to me, everything, and I hate getting rid of it. It's like throwing out precious paint. And I don't want to do it, but sometimes you have to do it, because again, you don't want people wandering in the woods in the dark with all this extra stuff there. So sometimes I think it's really beneficial for the author to ask, does this really need to be in here, or does it need to be in here right now? I mean, can you use it later? You can just take it out, put it somewhere else. I think that's a hard question that I think in the editing phase, which is what triggered this, you definitely need to ask, because I've edited some things that were like 200,000 words, and I, like 35% did not need to be in there. And you have to kind of find a nice way to bring it up. But if it's not necessary, it can feel burdensome to the reader. And it can also cause confusion. Your conflict can get lost in all the extraneous scenes and extraneous threads and everything like that. So it's I would say a vital question to ask when you're editing, if it's necessary. So that's it.
Isn't it so much fun to write all that extra stuff? I don't get rid of any of it. I have a boneyard file and I just put it all in there if I don't need it in the story. Okay, cool. Well, those are great questions. I think those are really good tools to be able to use while writing. I wrote most of them down. So I'm going to skip my next question because we've already answered that one, and go to say outside examples. We've gotten your examples. So what are some examples of books with strong conflict? And can you break down why they have such a strong conflict? And if not books, movies, comics, anything that really sticks out to you as having a strong conflict, and why?
I'm going to steal the example you guys quoted earlier because I loved it as well. The Expanse series, both the books and the movies, but they're basically movies, the TV series. It's amazing what they've done in terms of world building. Both the political side of things. My big thing is sort of politics and legal systems in speculative fiction in general. As a lawyer, it's something I'm really in tune with, and I absolutely love everything they've done with that. The whole again, how the world building, how the history of the expansion to the solar system, all that absolute amazing cultural divergence and specialization, and the creation of new cultures, and the biology that goes with that. Exactly, how the Belters physically cannot go back to Earth because of the obviously the sort of physical evolution traits, that they can no longer tolerate the gravity physically. It's just absolutely amazing. And then how all those physical constraints that create constant life and death conflict, and then the economic conflict on Earth with overpopulation and the political system there, the militarization of it's just amazing how they've taken all those different conflict elements, and out of a dozen different sectors, and then obviously all the individual things on top of that, and that are accentuated by all of that, just woven them all together, I think is a really good example of how to do it right.
JRH brings up how to do it right. Now I'm going to tell you in speculative fiction how to do it wrong. So I'm a big Halo fan, and Halo has one of the most straightforward and concrete conflicts in all of science fiction. Aliens are bad. They're coming to kill us all. We have to stop them from killing us. And so Halo 1, 2, and 3 had this tremendous through line. It starts, Master Chief has to save the universe, ends with Master Chief saves the universe. And then 4 and 5 come out, and it's the complete opposite side of the spectrum of what a conflict should be in a story. And it's anyone who's played the stories know that the studio that did 4 and 5 is a different studio made of people who were or were not part of the original games. So they tried to go in a different direction, and they tried to go with episodic villains. And that really fell off a cliff and was not well received because there was no through line to the original 3 games. And so like, I keep coming back to this idea of a through line. It's so important to make sure that from the very beginning to the very end, there's some sort of convergence all the way through. So yeah, I could literally, I'm trying my best to like control myself right now because I could go off on an hour and just an hour about Halo and what they did with 4 and 5. But yeah, having that through line is just so.
I guess I'll go next. One that comes to the front of my mind is The Martian. I really the film. I read the book ages ago, but I cannot tell you what happened. But the film I really liked because, for one, you're already on a planet that's not really all that habitable to begin with, so you're already up against an alien nature kind of force. Alien planet kind of thing going on. So it's not a habitable environment. And then, he gets left behind and injured, which is like the first conflict. It's very basic. Like, for me, like the worst thing that could happen in the woods is being mauled by a bear, hurt, and being stuck there and something eats me. So like that scene where he gets like something hits him, I think it's part of the ship, hits him and is stuck in his side. That's very dangerous when you're by yourself on a planet with no actual hospital to go to. So immediately you're sucked into this sort of atmosphere of tension. And then it just keeps kind of going from there. They give you a breather, things are fine, he's kind of doing stuff, and then he doesn't really, he needs to make food, and then that becomes a problem. Then he has to problem solve on how to get a habitable environment in his ship, his little dome. And then, eventually I think that blows out, something happens, it explodes. But every time in between, what I love is that you get that sense finally of, things are working out. He'll be able to get off this rock. And then something else happens. Like when it rains, it pours. And it just gets progressively more worse as the film goes, to the point where he's forced to just get in a dodgy ship, which the top is open. And I don't think anybody has to be a scientist to know that's just insane. Go up into space. It's either stay there and die or be shot up in space and die. And I like that you have to just choose between those extremes, and just that choice in general created the ultimate tension. But no, it gets worse after that because he has to slingshot out of it. So it's one of those things where they really build on by starting with seemingly small things, like, okay, we just need to find a way to survive, to you're pretty much up against your death here, but you have no choice. It's either die down the rock or die in space trying to get off. So I really liked how they did that. And I would say that the little breathers in between is what made it so awesome, because you would just get settled in that sense of things are working out for him. Things are going well. And there's no wood to knock on and something happens. So I really liked that about that film. And I would say another good example would be Interstellar, but I'm not going to break that one down. But that one is just constant conflict to the end. But that one, I think the only thing I will speak on is it has really good internal conflicts. I won't talk about the external ones, but the idea of going into space where on different planets, because of the rotation, time works a little bit differently. The idea that he isn't going to get back by the time his daughter is an old lady, essentially, that, I'm not a parent, but I can imagine as a parent would be, you're missing their entire life. So that alone just adds conflict. You're aware of that fact when he lands on the planet that's it's made out of water and they're by the black hole. As soon as you know that they are late getting off, you know that it's already 23 years older for her. So I think science fiction films for me have beautiful conflict. They just rack it up every time. And they're my favorites, those two.
The Martian's a particularly good example because you were saying that, it's good when you get sucked in to the environment. I mean, that's literally the issue and the conflict in The Martian, isn't it? You're literally getting sucked in to the environment. So, yeah.
I love it. Those movies cured me of a wish of ever going into space. I think those and Gravity that was I had to breathe through that movie just to get through it. So thing after. I think there's a lot of good examples. I think if you're learning about conflict and just trying to study it, I think the best place to turn to are fairy tales. This might seem a bit weird, but I think these are often such brilliant little pieces of storytelling that have evolved over thousands of years. So never change a winning team. I think that's the expression. So when I'm teaching conflict, I often use fairy tales, things like Hans and Grietje, Hansel and Gretel, I think.
Yeah.
Things like that are really, if you study it, it has such a clear plot line and such a clear conflict line, and it has all the things that good conflict needs. It's personal, the stakes are high, there's time pressure, it's dramatic. So and I think that's great. I think in Hans and Grietje especially, you can see also how the conflict escalates. It gets worse and worse. It begins with this this high stake premise of two kids left in the woods by their parents because they have no food, which is quite harsh if you think about it. And then they see this candy house and they think, oh, this solves a problem, but there's a child eating witch, and well, it gets worse and worse. So I think if you're studying conflict, break down these fairy tales. And also in terms of, because they seem really simple, but they also tell humane stories. Like in this story, it's about a girl who has to learn that she can trust her intuition and her wit to outsmart an adult. It's like a coming of age story, really. So I think that's a really good starting point, and I really, really love doing that.
Nice. I like the fairy tale angle. That's cool. And I've gone back and looked at some fairy tales, and the original versions are very, very dark in most cases, which is cool to read. So we're just about out of time on this one. I don't know about all you, but it was fun for me. I learned a lot.
Sure.
So does anyone have any closing words they wanted to make? Any plugs they wanted to make?
Sure. If you're a science fiction and fantasy superhero author, please reach out to me on Twitter, because I'd like to bring you into the community that I'm building.
Jay, you already got a lot of yours out. Did you want to go over any again?
Well, just, yeah, feel free to, sorry, where is it now? I'm pointing over here. Reach out to me at Space Lawyer SF on Twitter for, you know, anything and everything. That's what it's there for. So yeah, my two currently published books, they're Always Greener and The Rude Eye Rebellion, science fiction humor, absurdist humor with etymology footnotes leading up to direct democratic revolution. So, you know, do what you gotta do. But yeah, also, so that's ebook, paperback, hardcover, audiobook from Tantor Media. So it's all available everywhere, and more to come.
Great. Anyone else? All good?
Well, if you love Dutch movies or Dutch books, just find me on Twitter. If you want to learn Dutch, my books are a great starting point. It's great. I'm also working on a role-playing game. It's called HoloLand. It's about Dutch history in the 19th century, also combined with fairy tales and questions about the role of Dutch colonialism in the world. So, and it's a project I'm doing with my partner in English, because my wife is a translator, so she can really correct our mistakes. If you like it, we're sort of trying to kickstart it, so you can follow it along and read my work in a language you can understand.
I guess I'll go. If you like writing, editing tips, random nerddom, Japanese, dark stories, poetry, etc., pretty much everything. You can find me on Twitter. My name on there is Soufflé Lumiere. I'll write it somewhere. It's really, I don't know why, it just sounded really great, and I'm bad at French, but it sounded nice. And also, if you just like reading or engaging with readers, or you're an indie author and you want to find a home potentially, Bookish Valhalla, we talk about books, we interview authors, we try to boost the indie community, and that's bookishvalhalla.org. And my author site is listed on my Twitter, so I won't plug that. So.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're right at time, like perfectly. So thank you very much. And thanks for everyone watching.